Are outside the entrance to Creevelea Friary, just outside Dromahare in the county of Leitrim. This Franciscan observant friary was founded in 1508 by Margaret O'Rourke, the daughter of the O'Brien of Thomond, with the help of her husband, Eoghan O'Rourke, Lord of West Bréifne, Lord of effectively the most powerful ruler in what is now the modern county of Leitrim in his day. What tells us that this structure was originally a Franciscan foundation? Well, here we are outside the main entranceway into the nave of the church. We note the hood moulding over the doorway. But what's interesting is that on either side of the hood moulding, we have the remains of a rope that has 2 knots on this side and 1 knot on the other side. In fact, what's happened here in a way is that the original sculptor has turned the hood moulding into what appears to be the cincture or rope belt that a Franciscan would have worn around their waist to tie up their habit as such, their brown habit. So what do the knots represent? Well, they represent the Franciscan ideal of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Remember, the Franciscans were founded by St. Francis of Assisi back in the early 13th century. They certainly appear in Ireland by around 1230. We have Franciscan houses at Youghal and Dublin by that date. But in the 15th century and very early 16th century, there's a resurgence or a renaissance for the Franciscans and indeed the Dominicans throughout Gaelic and Gaelicized Ireland. I think something like 21 friaries are actually founded, Franciscan friaries are founded in 15th and early 16th century Gaelic and Gaelicized Ireland. So they're immensely popular amongst, if you like, the native Irish lords of the late medieval period, the Franciscans and indeed the Dominicans. We are looking at one of the openings of the cloister arcade. And under, if you like, the curved soffit of the arch of this opening, we have a carving of St. Francis showing the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, which is supposed to have happened to St. Francis during his life. At one stage, he showed evidence of stigmata. Of course, an indication to people in his day that he was a man of immense piety and a worthy man to follow. But also, we actually have some Latin script here, which more or less says, "Here is Francis." So it's actually telling us that this is a carving of Francis. Further down the opening, we have something that is really interesting, and that is a carving clearly of St. Francis talking from a pulpit with the preaching staff of the Franciscan friars behind him, but preaching in a pulpit. And the pulpit is in the form of a calyx of a flower. And the stem curves around. There's attractive leaf foliage coming out of the stem, if you like. And on the stem, St. Francis is preaching to 3 birds. Now, it's difficult to see with the naked eye as such, but it tells us quite a lot. First of all, St. Francis was known for his love of nature and particularly animals. St. Francis's, to this day, St. Francis's feast day, the 4th of October, is World Animal Day. Where there's a celebration of fauna throughout the world. St. Francis is also, I might add, the patron saint of Italy. But here he is preaching to 3 birds. That is, if you like, uh, the great image of St. Francis, preaching to birds and to animals. And as I say, that's why I think he's not only the patron saint of Italy, he's actually the patron saint of animals as well. So St. Francis has a connection with us today throughout the church and its claustral buildings that show or give us indications that this was a Franciscan foundation. In 1508, Margaret O'Rourke and her husband Eoghan O'Rourke, Lord of West Bréifne, basically the most powerful man in the modern county of Leitrim in his day, founded this friary. Now, what's interesting about Margaret in particular is that her sister, Fionnuala or Nuala, was married to O'Donnell, Lord of Tyrconnell in County Donegal. And Nuala and her husband, or Hugh, founded the Franciscan friary in Donegal in 1474. Now, it's clear that that friary, the friars in that friary, impressed Margaret. And a number of years later, in 1508, Margaret and her husband Eoghan O'Rourke invited friars from Donegal to come and found this friary here. What we want to ask as well is that, apart from being impressed by the Franciscans, why would Margaret and Eoghan have wanted to build a friary in Creevelea, here at Creevelea? The first thing we can say is that obviously there were religious reasons. It was a sign of their faith. You know, it was a place where masses would be said for themselves and their families in perpetuity. There would also be the right to burial, possibly on the gospel or north side of the high altar. But there were other reasons as well, because of course Creevelea is beside Dromahair. And Dromahair from the mid-15th century onwards was the principal centre, if you like, of O'Rourke power in County Leitrim. And so the creation of a friary here would have been linked to the aggrandizement of their principal castle here at Dromahair. What else can we say? Well, part of the problem for the O'Rourkes at this stage was that there was no up-to-date modern friary within their lordship. And that's quite interesting in itself, because the O'Conors, for example, in North Roscommon and their vassal clans had founded Dominican friaries right throughout from the mid-13th century onwards. But this had not happened in the O'Rourke lordship of West Bréifne. And it's quite interesting. I'm not a historian, I'm an archaeologist, but it's quite interesting because it's clear that an older form of church organization continued throughout the Middle Ages in Bréifne. The Earleys, the Eirina families, the O'Roddies of Fina, the Earleys of Drumreilly, you know, these were important churchmen, but they were not linked to things like the Franciscan or Dominican order, okay? So it would seem that one of the reasons why the O'Rourkes wanted to found a friary here was to have a high status burial place for their dynasty, okay? So that's kind of interesting, because hitherto quite a number of O'Rourkes had actually been buried in the Dominican friary at Sligo. The other thing, when we mention Sligo, what's interesting about Dromahair at this time is that it's clear that Sligo, under the O'Conor Sligo and various Sligo clans, had become a very, very rich trading port. And it's clear that I think the reason why the O'Rourkes shift, if you like, their power towards Dromahair, and indeed Newtown, where Parks Castle is now, on the, if you like, the eastern end of Lough Gill, was linked to the fact that they wanted to be quite close to Sligo for economic reasons. That would be my feeling. But anyway, I think the main point here was that there were a number of reasons why Margaret and Eoghan O'Rourke would want to build a friary at this particular point. Now, what else can we say? Yeah, the thing that's curious about this friary is that in 1511, Thomas MacBrady, Bishop of Kilmore, seems to visit the friary to dedicate the church here, okay? Now, what's interesting about that is that he is the Bishop of Kilmore. We are actually just into the Diocese of Ardagh. Now, technically, in my opinion, if anybody should have been dedicating the church, it possibly should have been the Bishop of Ardagh. But I think, you know, again, because across the river where the O'Rourke Castle was in Dromahare, that was in the Diocese of Kilmore. So, if you like, boundaries were blurred, etc., and the Bishop of Kilmore was the one who dedicated the friary here in 1511. Now, it's also interesting, well, sort of, you know, there's a little bit of blurred nature of boundaries here. Why didn't the O'Rourkes place their friary back across the River Bonnet into the Diocese of Kilmore, somewhere in the say the middle of where Dromahare village is today? And it would seem to me that again we're back to the idea of aggrandizement, lordly status, and that if we look at this location, it's a very nice location above the left bank of the River Bonnet, which I probably am pronouncing wrongly, but it's within direct sight of where O'Rourke's Tower House and feasting hall, the feasting hall still exists, would have been located. So O'Rourke's could have shown, if you like, their visitors their power, their status, if you like, by looking directly across the river at this wonderful friary. So a little bit of demonstration of status, if you like, was linked to why it's just located into the Diocese of Ardagh. So I just mentioned that in 1511, Thomas MacBrady, Bishop of Kilmore, dedicates the church there. Unfortunately, he seems to have died here immediately afterwards. Now again, one of the reasons why Margaret and Eoghan O'Rourke would have founded this friary was to provide a high status burial place for themselves. And unfortunately, in 1512 or perhaps 1513, Margaret dies and is buried here in the friary church. Now, again, what's interesting about this is that the Annals of Ulster, you know, the other references just say she died, but the Annals of Ulster tell us something quite interesting. And they say that Margaret died in the wooden church. This is all in Irish. Died in the wooden church that she had built for the Franciscan friars here at Creevelea. Okay, now that's interesting. That suggests that the original church was not in stone as we see it today, but built in wood. Now, if I can just expand on that a little bit, I recently published an article in Sligo History and Society on the Dominican Priory at Sligo. Now, that Dominican Priory is founded in the mid-13th century. We know that the church that exists there was built of stone from the beginning, as was the chapter house and the sacristy. In the mid-15th century, the whole place is completely rebuilt. And when we actually look at the remains, we find no indication, we'll say, in the refectory there at Sligo, in the dormitories, etc. The northern side of the priory, we find no indication of 13th century stonework, okay, diagonally tooled stones. And that suggests to me that a lot of the original priory of Sligo was built in wood. this seems to have been the case here, perhaps for the whole structure in the early 16th century. That if we're to take the Annals of Ulster literally, the friary here may originally have been built of wood. And then, you know, and again, people think, well, wood, you know, it's not particularly, you know, high status. But at the same time, remember that medieval carpenters could put up some pretty impressive wooden buildings. And that's possibly what happened here. So we're working on the assumption then that the original friary would have been built of wood, 1520s, possibly 1528. Eoghan, one of the original founders, the husband of Margaret, dies and is buried here within the priory, presumably within the priory church. What's interesting about Eoghan, in his last year or last few months, we hear he takes the habit of a Franciscan. Now that probably means that he became a lay friar, okay, a non-ordained friar. Aristocrats in the medieval period regularly took, in the last few months or year of their life or so, regularly took the habit of the friaries or monasteries, or, you know, the orders that they had patronized during their life, okay? So there's nothing strange about that. We hear of an O'Hanley doing this at the Dominican Priory in Roscommon, an O'Hanley, Lord of Tretuaha, doing this. So this is a regular occurrence. And of course the reason, presumably, was to help them to prepare themselves for death, to atone for their sins. And remember, a medieval lord like Eoghan O'Rourke, probably to retain power, had to be pretty ruthless, okay? And there probably were a lot of sins to atone for. And so there's nothing particularly strange about Eoghan doing this. I think Rory O'Conor, you know, the so-called last High King of Ireland, and King of Connacht, in his last years, took religious vows as well, okay? Right, okay, so we go forward a little bit to 1532, and we hear of the murder of another Eoghan O'Rourke, who is described as a gentleman of the O'Rourke sept, murdered by the O'Mulveys and their kinsmen within the precincts of the church. That's an abuse of sanctuary. But again, in 1536, we hear that the church and the friary burn down. 2 friars die in this conflagration, Eoghan O'Donnell and a McGauran. Firstly, it would appear that if, you know, Eoghan O'Donnell may well have been one of the original friars who came from Donegal in 1508. Those of you who are from around this part of the world might say, how do you know that? Well, he's an O'Donnell. That means he originated in Donegal, okay? So he probably was one of the original friars who came here to found the friary as a daughter house of Donegal Friary. Okay, now the McGauran man is interesting too, because the McGaurans, you know, are a sept of the West Cavan area, more or less within a vassal clan, if you like, of the O'Rourkes of Bréifne, and they have a long association as well with this friary, as we'll see later on. So 1536 conflagration. Now it's clear when we look at Leask, the architectural historian of the 20th century, the most prominent architectural historian of the 20th century, Colman O'Claba, you know, a renowned historian of the Franciscan and Dominican friars in Ireland, and others, believe that actually the structure that we see here, most of it, if not all of it, may date to after this fire. Because remember, it's possible that the friary was originally built of wood, of timber, okay? So there's a strong possibility. Leask is quite strong in this. He thinks a number of the features are that little bit later than we'll say the early 15th, very early 15th century, and may date more to the late 1530s or 1540s. Now that is not, like, to excuse the pun, set in stone, but there is a strong possibility that everything we see here post-dates that fire in 1536. Most of what we see within this friary, if not all. Unfortunately, you know, it's difficult to be exact, but there's a strong possibility. And I say, Harold Leask, as I said, that great architect historian of 20th century Ireland, believed that. And I note that Coleman O'Claba, in his book on the Friars in Ireland, a 2012 book, sort of hints at the same as well. Okay, so what else? Yeah, the 1536 fire, we also hear that vestments, you know, expensive vestments, chalices, and valuable books are burned. And that's a reminder of, you know, the possessions of a friary like this. Religious books, wonderful vestments, probably donated by local worthies to the friary, chalices the same. But we also hear that this friary had been used by local people to store their goods as such, because it was felt that a friary was a safer place to keep secular goods than, we'll say, within their houses, because of, you know, there's quite a lot of feuding and raiding going on and things like that. Now, as we've seen in 1532 with poor old Eoghan O'Rourke, sanctuary, you know, in the safety of a friary is not always guaranteed. But to a certain extent, local people would leave goods within the friary, in the possession of the friary, for safekeeping. And we hear that a lot of local goods owned by ordinary people and probably well-to-do people burned in that 1536 fire. The friary is rebuilt, as I say, in stone, very definitely in stone, by the son of the founders, the son of Margaret and Eoghan O'Rourke, Brian Balach O'Rourke, Lord of Bréifne. Okay, so as I say again, there is a good chance what we're looking at here in terms of the structure we see today post-dates 1536. That does not mean that the original wooden church or wooden claustral buildings were somehow inferior. As I've said before, medieval carpenters can put up some pretty complex timber buildings, and I think that's something we forget in Ireland, you know, because we don't have that many, or sorry, we hardly have any, if you like, vernacular timber buildings surviving, unlike, we'll say, rural Britain with their black and white buildings or large parts of the continent. Okay, so Brian Balach O'Rourke rebuilds the friary, certainly in stone. Okay, what else can we say? So the friary continues. The friars probably come from local aristocratic families. We know, for example, Conor O'Rourke, the son of Bréifne na Murtha O'Rourke, was a friar, became a Franciscan friar, and presumably took his vows here. So local families like the McGorans, the O'Rourkes, local prominent families, O'Rourkes, etc., you know, sons became friars, but also maybe members of the learned families of the area, let's say like the O'Kearneys, or you know, maybe some of the old members of some of the old Erna families as well, who were associated with the church since early medieval times. So you can basically say that the friars, in a general sense, came from aristocratic or gentry backgrounds. Now, lay friars probably existed as well. And lay friars seem to have done some of the, you know, the ordinary work around the friary, which I'll get to in a minute. Now, apart from what we said a few minutes ago, that, you know, aristocratic men, maybe in the last months of their life, became lay friars, took a certain amount of vows as a lay friar of the Franciscan order, or for that matter, Dominican order. Most lay friars probably came from ordinary backgrounds, okay? I've always thought about that, you know, some are equal, all are equal in the eyes of God, but some are more equal than others. And certainly the friars from aristocratic and gentry backgrounds would have been in control, and you know, the prior would have come from that sort of background. So the poor old lay friars came from relatively ordinary backgrounds. Now that's interesting in itself, because in theory, Franciscan and Dominican friaries were not supposed to own land. You know, the vow of poverty was important. The vow of austerity and poverty, particularly in observant friaries like here at Dromahare. But however, we do know, and we see it both in the Dominican priory at Sligo, the Dominican priory at Roscommon, we have small farms associated with the friaries. So presumably these small farms, you know, maybe 50 to 100 acres, provided, if you like, basic foods for the friars that lived here, the lay friars, you know, meat, dairy produce, vegetables, you know, corn, etc. So small farms certainly seem to have been associated with these friaries. And at the very end of, you know, the medieval period, in the first years of the 16th century, we hear that the friars had some land in the vicinity of this friary. Remember, with the late 16th century, we get the Tudor reconquest of Ireland. And of course, there had been the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII, where friaries and monasteries became the property of the crown in England and Ireland, the Dublin government in Ireland. But of course, the O'Rourkes were virtually independent, and the friary continued on here quite late. But at the same time, the writing was on the wall. And in 1590, we hear that, I think it was Richard Bingham, governor of Connacht, actually takes over the friary, kicks the poor old friars out, burns some of the wooden furniture, stables his horses here, and generally creates destruction of at least some of the priory. I think, again, looking at what we can see of the historical documents, Bingham leaves and the friars come back. But in 1598, it would appear that the friars were expelled from this friary, and it was taken over by Crown forces. Now, what happens then? Well, certainly in the early 17th century, we hear of a Lieutenant Harrison here at the, you know, owning, if you like, or holding the friary and its lands, and presumably other lands in the vicinity. He would have been a new English soldier, a soldier of the Elizabethan and Jacobean army, and we hear of him here certainly in 1517. What happened to the friars? Well, it would appear that the friars continued to live and operate and preach in the vicinity of the priory here, okay? Living in maybe thatched cabins somewhere nearby. We hear in 1642, during the Confederate Wars and the 1641 rebellion and things like that, the friars take advantage of that and come back and reoccupy the priory here, okay? Then, with the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 1650s, the Franciscan friars are again expelled, and they remain expelled from the friary, although a number of them at later dates are still buried here, as we'll see later. They continue to operate in the vicinity, again, presumably in, you know, ordinary thatched houses somewhere in the vicinity of the friary. Remember again that the Catholic religion is under pressure, if you like, from the Church of Ireland Protestant government, controlled government. Franciscan friar Patrick O'Healy Bishop of Mayo, appears to have been ordained here, did his novitiate here in the middle years of the 16th century. Why is Bishop Patrick O'Healy famous? Well, he was tortured and martyred by Crown forces and eventually executed at Kilmallock in County Limerick in 1579. Remember again, he was a Franciscan friar. There were laws against the Catholic Church at the time. He had been and studied on the continent as well. So he was regarded as an enemy of the state by the English-controlled Dublin government. So he was captured in strange circumstances, actually, martyred, tortured and martyred. Alongside him, Conor O'Rourke, the son of Bréifne na Murtha, who we might talk about later on, O'Rourke, Lord of Bréifne, was executed as well. Now, what's interesting about the two of them is that they were beatified in 1992 by Pope John Paul II, and they're regarded as, I think they're two of the 24 recognized Irish martyrs, Irish Catholic martyrs by the Roman Catholic Church. So O'Healy spent, if you like, his training here as a friar and was ordained here in the middle years of the 16th century, and unfortunately met an untimely and painful end at Kilmallock in 1579. We also know that Donna Mooney, or Donatus Mooney, I think originally from Donegal, served as a friar here as well in the first years of the 17th century. He seems to have been ordained here as well and said his first mass here within the bounds of this friary, whether at the high altar or one of these side altars in the transept that we're in now. So who is Donatus Mooney? Well, first of all, he was provincial of the Irish Franciscan order, you know, the head Franciscan in Ireland, in the early 17th century. He wrote a very useful history of the Irish Franciscan order, and he was the first rector of the Irish Franciscan College at Louvain in Belgium, in modern-day Belgium. So overall, a very distinguished person, renowned for his intellectual ability. He taught philosophy and philology on the continent in various universities. Overall, a very distinguished man. So that's two of the friars who were associated with this priory at Creevelea, and both were distinguished men, one of whom died for his faith. Here we have a grave of Bishop Thady or Thaddeus O'Rourke, Bishop of Killala, who died in 1735. Because I descend directly from the brother of this man, Colonel Kieran O'Rourke, who died in 1702 at the Battle of Luzara. He was one of the Wild Geese and had been a Jacobite commander during the Williamite War. He died at the Battle of Luzara in 1702. His daughter Mary married my ancestor, Denis O'Connor, Donachalea. Both were the parents of the antiquarian and Catholic rights activist Charles O'Conor, antiquarian historian and Catholic rights activist Charles O'Conor of Ballinagar. The ruins of Ballinagar I own to this day. But anyway, Bishop Thady or Thaddeus was a Franciscan. That's why he's buried here. He's an interesting man because for a part of his early career as an ordained Franciscan, he was the military chaplain to Prince Eugene of Savoy, who was one of the greatest military commanders in the Europe of his day. Eventually, he is made, Thady or Thaddeus is made Bishop of Killala, Roman Catholic Bishop of Killala, comes back to Ireland. And of course, because of the penal laws, has to be pretty circumspect and stays relatively anonymously in various houses, including and largely at Ballinagar, at his niece's house, Mary, and her husband Dennis at Ballinagar in County Roscommon. Now, the other thing that's interesting about him is that while he's at Ballinagar, he actually involves himself in the teaching of the very young Charles O'Conor of Ballinagar. He introduces him to Latin and Greek, many of the classical authors and things like that. So he plays and is acknowledged as playing a large part in the, if you like, the educational formation of Charles O'Conor of Ballinagar, who goes on, for example, to write the dissertations on the ancient history of Ireland, which is published in 1753, and then the second edition, I think, comes out in 1766. And Charles O'Connor's book, The Dissertations on the Ancient History of Ireland, is really the first time in English that, if you like, a pro-Irish version of history is actually written. You know, Charles O'Conor argues that there was civilization in early Ireland, that it wasn't the sort of barbarous place that both English and Anglo-Irish writers had suggested over the centuries. So that's the first time in English that, in a way, you get an Irish, written in English, you get a history book that is very sort of pro-Irish as such, or at least pro-Catholic Irish, anyway, or pro-Indigenous Irish. Okay, so this is Bishop Thady's grave. Now, the other thing, of course, about it is that Bishop Thady and Colonel Kieran O'Rourke are the grandnephews of Bréifne O'Rourke, who's hung at Tyburn in London, I think, in 1691 for rebellion, and also sheltering members of the Spanish Armada who made it ashore after the wreck of a number of Spanish naval vessels off the coast of Sligo. Okay, so that's also interesting. So that gives me, if you like, a O'Rourke ancestry. But of course, more than that, because Bréifne Murtha's daughter Mary, another Mary, actually marries, I think, the great-grandfather of Charles O'Conor, Sir Hugh O'Conor, who's the O'Conor Don of the day. So I have two links to this friary, two O'Rourke links. So in a way, going into this friary is quite special, if you like, for me. Are interested in the Franciscans within the county of Leitrim, and of course here at Creevelea Friary, there's a very excellent article by Liam Kelly, Father Liam Kelly. He may be Monsignor now, I'm not sure, but anyway, Father Liam Kelly in Leitrim History and Society. But he notes that there's a Franciscan presence within the general Dromahair area right down to the early 19th century. And here within the friary, we have the grave of Father Peter Bernard McGowan, okay, who was a Franciscan, but also was parish priest of Kilumry and Killary. And he dies in 1837. So there's a Franciscan presence within the county right down to the early 19th century. Looking at Father McGowan's grave, people are still leaving, you know, rosary beads, spoons, money, various, you know, little religious statues as sort of votive deposits. So he clearly, his memory is still revered, if you like, in the Dromahair area. I mean, it's also interesting that he's called McGowan as well. And again, I think as we've seen, one of the first friars here was a McGowan, who was one of those, unfortunately, one of those two friars burned in 1532 when there was a terrible fire in the friary. So, you know, tradition lived on amongst the McGowan family, I suppose, and they had a special devotion, I suppose, to the Franciscan order. The holy water font on our left. The reason why there are no windows on the northern side of the nave is because there were claustral buildings to our north, but we notice one window there on the southern wall, and also, of course, this very fine traceried window. Like, that is a very fine example of early 16th century traceried window. Let's get the impression that it's representing flower bulbs or something like that, which in itself might be a reference back to St. Francis's love of the natural world. That's just a theory. It's 2 lights in width, but it must have given this nave area, lit up this nave area very, very well. The nave, of course, was where the ordinary people would have come to hear Mass celebrated by one of the Franciscans, but also to hear the Franciscans preaching, because that was one of the major roles of the Franciscans in the medieval world, and that is to preach the gospel to ordinary folk. So this was the area where ordinary people would have heard the Franciscans preaching and would have heard or heard Mass as well. We presume at the end of the nave, where the tower begins, there would have been a wooden screen with possibly a pulpit for preaching and possibly 2 altars as well. In the north wall, there also appears to be a doorway leading out into the cloister area, the claustral buildings, and the cloister garth, that open space around which the friary, rectangular or square shape, around which the friary buildings were located. So the nave is an important area. And this is quite a sizable nave, and it would have been able to accommodate quite large numbers of people coming to hear the Franciscans preach. Okay, so if we move on, we can then go into the transept area here. Very often in Franciscan friary and Dominican friaries, the transept is later. But here we can see that the transept is bonded into the main structure of the church. So it's contemporary with the church. So what happens in the transept? Again, it was probably dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The Franciscans had a strong devotion to the Virgin Mary. We can see these 2 fine arches here. You note the punch dressing as well. Very much a feature of friaries and tower houses in the 15th and 16th century in Ireland. Very fine, detailed work. But here in the transept, we can see that it was lit on the southern side by, again, from what we can see, a very fine traceried window as well. Possibly a smaller version of what we've just seen in the nave, in the west gable of the nave. But here we have 2 recesses lit by round-headed windows, possibly we'd say elliptical-headed windows rather than round-headed, but round will do. Okay, there originally would have been an altar here. I mean, there is some sort of stone altar-like feature, but that's clearly later, probably a carved wooden altar, and another carved wooden altar in the other niche. We have little niches for the storage of materials used in the Mass. Okay, so these would have been side altars where Franciscans would have come in each day to say, if you like, Mass. I think, from what I know, I think ordained friars did want to say Mass at least once a day. But also, of course, remember that local people, particularly local gentry or aristocrats, would pay for Masses to be said for their family and things like that. So to a certain extent, it was by saying Mass, it was a form of income. But anyway, very nice little round arched niches, still very attractive. And over here as well. Interestingly, here we have a stone, flat-topped stone jutting out. I would suggest to you that a statue existed here, possibly a statue of the Virgin Mary, or possibly one of St. Francis himself. Okay, just to remind people. Again, little storage niches, as I said. This niche here is a little bit more ornate, almost seems to have an ogee-headed head to it. And I wonder if that isn't a piscina niche, where the ground level, because of burial, has risen, that was actually a piscina where holy vessels were washed after Mass. They couldn't be sort of washed outside the holy precincts of a church, had to be washed within the church, and the water seep into the ground of the church for sacred reasons. Okay, again, remember both in the nave, the choir, all the buildings of the church, it would have been rendered, plastered inside, rendered outside for weatherproofing, inside plastered. And I would think, on analogy with elsewhere, there would have been wall paintings, biblical wall paintings, telling stories, biblical stories, the crucifixion of Christ, that type of thing, adorning the walls. And of course there would have been carved wooden screens and carved wooden statues and things like that. Now we just see the bare stone bones of a church. But remember, at the time, smell of incense, candles, wall paintings, carvings, carvings in wood as in stone, as we've seen. It would have been a lot more, dramatic than we see it today. At the bell tower of the church, which acted as a separation between the nave and the choir or chancel, the more holy area of the church, leading on to the high altar and the sanctuary. Again, the tower is interesting from a architectural point of view. It's not the slender belfry-like tower that we normally associate with Franciscan towers. It's a much more sort of broader, rectangular type of tower that we associate with, I think, what occurred at Roscommon Priory originally, the Dominican Priory at Roscommon, and also what we know exists or existed at the Dominican Priory at Burrishoole. Again, both dating to the 15th, 16th century, like here. So it's not quite the same, but it's possible that the prior lived within it. There's definitely accommodation within this tower, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But the main bell, if you like, of the friary would have been located here in the top floor. And bells were kind of interesting because they called the faithful, the friars, to the divine offices, to Mass. They tolled for the dead in times of danger. They were told, the bells were rung to warn people of danger, but also to ward off evil. That's quite interesting, I think, that somehow bells had this, I think it's called apotreic quality, that somehow they could ward off evil influences and things like that. So bells had a number of functions within a friary, the main one being to call the friars and lay friars to the divine offices and to Mass, but other functions as well. Again, it's clear looking at it that this tower was rebuilt possibly in the 17th century. It's been said again that this might be linked to the retakeover of the friary or priory by the Dominican friars, just looking up at it, in the 1640s. But I see evidence of a gun loop, what I consider to be a gun loop, on the east side of this tower. This might suggest that that soldier Harrison in the early 17th century kind of used it as some form of a residence, whether he lived here the whole time or it was going to be you know, a place of retreat in case of attack. I don't know, but I do notice a gun loop on the east side of it, okay? So, I mean, it's possible the friars could have put in a gun loop at a later date, but I think it suggests Harrison. That's just an opinion, and I'll probably be proved wrong. The choir or chancel area of the church, this, if in a way, was reserved for the actual friars. Ordinary laity did not come into this part of the church, but of course, presumably important aristocratic guests may have been allowed. Okay, so what would this place have looked like during its use? Again, the friars, you would have had wooden stalls up against the walls of the church, with the friars looking not so much at the altar, but looking at the south and north walls of the choir. Okay, within the, if you like, on the floor of the choir here, we probably had a wooden pulpit as well, a carved wooden pulpit, where various liturgical readings were read out. Going forward, we're moving towards the sanctuary and where the high altar would have been. Note firstly, like again, this absolutely fantastic four-light traceried window that again dates to, I mean, we're going to say the early 15th century. It does not appear to date to the 1508 period, because we hear the church was wooden, so it kind of suggests around 1536, late 1530s or so. But again, that's open to debate. But again, you can see some very fine openings. Now, we'll talk about that in a minute, because there was stained glass within those windows, and indeed all windows within the church. Again, the walls would have been plastered, wall paintings would have existed as well, you know, religious themes to them. So you've got to imagine that. And then all the carved stalls, you know, the pulpit, etc. On our left there, we see the entranceway into the sacristy, where vestments, candles, chalices, etc., that were needed for the high altar were stored. Okay, so we're coming eastwards into where the sanctuary, where the high altar would have been. Again, I presume that that high altar would have been of wood, carved, maybe painted, you know, very ornate, underneath this great east window. On our right, we have an opening. It may be an aumbry, but it looks like a piscina, where again, sacred vessels after Mass were washed. You can see the fine detail of the punch dressing around it. And in the wall here, underneath, again, these round-headed or elliptical, perhaps that's a better word, windows, two light windows, we have a recess. And this seems to be the sedilia, where there would have been wooden seats, where those officiating at the Mass would have sat at certain times during the Mass. When they needed to. In the south wall, we see a little opening, a little window looking directly down onto the sanctuary. The high altar probably was raised that little bit higher than the rest of the sanctuary and the choir itself, you know, because the altar was there. The high altar is always on the east side of the church. It's well lit, of course, but of course the symbolism of the high altar is linked to the rising sun and the resurrection of Christ, okay? So we can see on at the lower part of one of the mullions of the window, we can see a vase or vase with a lily sticking out of it, carved in low relief. That suggests that this was part of an annunciation, of an annunciation scene. That the other narrative parts or elements of that annunciation scene were within the stained glass, were actually, in other words, you had an annunciation scene in coloured glass in those windows, with one element of that annunciation scene being carved. And I presume maybe painted as well, like the actual carved bit there. So an annunciation scene seems to have occurred in the windows of the east window of this great church. Up on the northern wall of the choir, if you like, overlooking the sanctuary and the high altar, high up, we have a little window. And again, you know, I think that could be because the dormitory, if you like, of the friars existed on that side. And it's possible that sick friars maybe could hear Mass being said from their bed, if you like. So that allowed, you know, very sick friars to hear Mass being said here and the divine offices being said here during the course of the day. Again, here you have here this grassy area is the cloister garth. Looking out at the cloister garth, this grassed area here. I mean, I know there are modern or relatively modern burials within it, but it would have been an open grassed area, possibly with a water fountain in the middle, but that's unclear. But around it, you would have had the cloister itself, which was a covered walkway. And which the friars would have processed around or would have walked around praying, reflecting on their sins and their future sins, maybe, I don't know, but anyway. But anyway, the cloister, and we see the cloister arcade, it's been restored on this southern side, but it's in a better state of preservation on the northern side. And it's kind of interesting in a way because there again appear to be round-headed arches on the cloister arcade on the southern side, but pointed ones on the northern side. That would have existed all the way around the cloister garth as such. Now again, you know, these friaries and indeed monasteries right throughout the Middle Ages had a certain set plan. The chapter house of the friary would have been entered through here. So this is the east side of the east side of the claustral buildings of this friary. So sacristy, you know, choir of the church, sacristy, chapter house, slip, and maybe this calefactory, this room where there was a constant fire for elderly or sick friars, okay, with a dormitory overhead. We see the oven of the friary here. We can see the, you know, presumably bread and things like that, and pies were baked here, but we can see that the stones of the oven were subjected to heat. That's very clear, you know. Okay, that might be 300 or 400 years ago, but they still show signs of being sort of, you know, affected, damaged by heat. Again, quite a well-lit room. I think this whole area here, not just this room, was linked to the preparation of food. Now, what's strange about this northern side of the building? You know, where we can see stairs leading up to a first floor. That first floor is quite well lit. At the far end, presumably entered by a narrow doorway, there appears to be a garderobe tower. That suggests that there was a dormitory element here over the refectory and kitchen. Now, as I say, normally, the dormitory of the friars is actually over the, in this case, over the chapter house and slip on the east side of the cloister. And it's clear there was a dormitory there. We presume lay friars actually lived over the storage spaces on the west side of the cloister. But here we have another, I think, dormitory, and I'm kind of curious about that. It shouldn't necessarily be here. What does that represent? I don't know. Maybe there were more friars than normal. Maybe they had a lot of guests over the years. You know, this was guest accommodation or something like that. But it's a little different to what I'm used to say Roscommon Priory or Sligo Priory. There doesn't appear to have been a direct entrance from the cloister to the refectory. One had to go into the sort of kitchen and serving area to get into the refectory, where the friars would have eaten their meals. Again, it's an interesting room, again lit by these round-headed or elliptical windows, which, single light, but then double light here, and then possibly treble light over here, and there's a niche. So what is this niche? So there's presumably 3 windows here. This is so it was a well-lit room, but this particular spot was very well lit. And of course, during the meals, the friars there would have been reading, a friar would have been assigned to read stories to the friars as they ate. They ate in silence, and they would have listened to stories about the saints, biblical stories, but also travel literature as well. So travel accounts, so it wasn't all necessarily purely religious. So this is where the reader, the friar assigned to read these stories, would have been located, would have been sat, if you like. Presumably, there was a wooden desk here and a chair, and he was a lot of light coming in. Okay, the friars themselves. Right, okay, so how did friars eat their meals? Well, again in silence. They would have entered through that doorway, washing their hands in a simple lavabo or, place to wash your hands. They would have come in. There possibly was a crucifix on this wall here, maybe just there. They would have blessed themselves, looked at the crucifix, blessed themselves. Then they would have taken their seat according to their, if you like, their position within the priory. The prior of the head friar possibly would have sat here, and then in order of seniority down the room. The friars, from what we can see, sat in benches against the wall, looking out into the central space which would have been kept free for people, presumably lay friars or servants, probably lay friars, serving the meal, but also for brother friars who were doing penance. They weren't allowed to eat, so they just had to stand in the middle here. So wooden benches along the side, some sort of crucifix underneath which the prior of the priory would have ate his meals with his, second, third, fourth in command on either side of him. Okay, so that's the refectory. So an interesting space. And again, overlooking the Bonnet, I hope I pronounced that right, people from Dromahare, Bonnet River, in a beautiful location, but within the whole priory, within view of the O'Rourke Tower House across the river. You know, again, I often think, you know, we somehow have this idea that, you know, it's a sort of commonly held idea today that people in the medieval period were somehow barbarous and pretty wild and things like that. But they appreciated, we know this, they appreciated beauty just like we do today. So this would have been an attractive room in an attractive location overlooking the river. We can hear it flowing away. It's a lovely sound. You know, remember right throughout the church, you know, the church itself, you know, stained glass windows, carvings, etc. You know, this was a place of beauty as well. And that beauty, you know, of course, there was a religious element to creating that beauty, but it also was appreciated, I think, by the friars themselves. Just done a tour of the priory. Just to sum up, you know, again, founded in 1508, but it's possible that the first buildings here were built of timber. Now again, that does not mean they were flimsy or anything like that. As I've said before, you know, medieval carpenters throughout Europe and including Ireland could put up quite complex timber structures. So it's possible, therefore, a lot of what we look at here today, that's standing today, the stone church and the claustral buildings to its north, date to a somewhat later period. And certainly scholars like Leask and now O'Claba kind of hint at that. So when could they been built? When could have these stone buildings been built? Possibly after 1536, when Brian Balach O'Rourke, Lord of Bréifne, the son of the founders, rebuilds the church after that disastrous fire. Okay, so you know that we'll never have the proper answer to that, I think, but that's the theory I'm working on at present. A very fine priory. Again, one has to remember that the buildings would have been rendered externally, plastered internally. The church itself would have been full of wall paintings, carvings, you know, candles, stained glass in all the windows, possibly scenes like the Annunciation would have occurred in the east window above the high altar, the east window of the choir, above the high altar and sanctuary. So you've got to kind of imagine that these places, you know, they're not the sort of grey stone buildings that we see today. They would have been places of, well, they are, it still is a place of immense beauty, but like really attractive when they were in use. What else can we say? You know, again, you know, Bishop O'Healy, Donna Mooney or Donatus Mooney were quite famous Franciscan friars who served here during their career. You know, maybe took their original vows here and things like that. Went on to become quite famous in their own right. Okay, so overall, a very fine priory. The people of Leitrim should be very proud to have it within their county boundaries, and I would suggest that you, particularly if your name is O'Rourke, McTiernan, McSharry, you know, all the Leitrim clans and things like that, come and visit this site.